Hello and welcome to this video, guys. Today we're going to look into Angular signals, which is something that will be released in Angular 16. So it's signals are a new way of managing state changes in Angular application. It's inspired by Solid.js. So what are really signals? So signals are functions that returns a value, a get and a set, and there's a couple of other functions that you can use, such as computed, mutate, and so on. So what are really signals? If you have worked with React before, you would not be very surprised with how this works. For instance, you have the use memo, you have use effect and so on, and you can have dependency arrays updating the values and so on. But in Angular, we haven't had this really before, so the signals will make it easier for us to work with boilerplate code. There will be less code. So jumping into the code, we can look here and we have the version of 16, so Angular version 16. So what we can do now is we can jump into the app component. So in here we can create a signal by writing a variable. So let's say counter equals to signal. All right, so we can import this one from Angular core. So in order for us to really get started, we need to update a couple of different packages. We need to make sure that we have the latest package that we can have. Potentially I'm having 16.0.0 next.3, which is essentially going to make it possible for me to use the signals. So let's get started. We can import the signal from Angular core. After importing that, we can utilize the signal in this way. So if you're familiar to the React way of writing it, it would be the use state in this case. In order for you to actually create a variable, here's the default value that you have. In this case, it's number 3, and this is the variable that we have. So there's a couple of different ways this could work. We could essentially, let's open up the HTML on the side here. For instance, we can say the app component HTML. Here we are at the bottom going to want to print the value of the actual counter. What you would have to do is you would have to call the counter with the function in this way, because this is going to call the getter for the counter that you have. So whenever the counter is changed, it will change this variable and it will also reflect the HTML in this case. So just imagine, now you might think, why would I want to have it in this way when I can have a simple variable with the counter? Changing that variable would change the content as well. So for these cases, we would say you would probably not need the signal. You could rather use a common variable. But now imagine we want to have some logic is where we want to make some changes on a different variable whenever we have a change in the counter, but we do not want to call a new function every time we change the counter. So in this case, let's say we have a constructor here. Here in the constructor, we're going to, we do not want to have like a subscription where we subscribe to the value and then we react to the value from here. So there's actually a feature that comes with it, comes with the Angular 16 as well. So it's called computed, and if you're familiar to use memo, this is quite similar. So the use memo from the React world. So for instance, we could have a third variable. In this case, we could say, all right, so here's counter is larger than 5. Let's say we have a variable called is larger than 5, and this will essentially just check if the variable is larger than 5. So in this case, you would probably have to have a listener or a function that would change the variable or change something in order for you to receive a new value for this is larger than 5. It could be that you reset it from the HTML here. Probably you could have an ngIf and so on for the counter value, but let's imagine you want to change something in the TS file. In this case, you could use the computed. So if you would go ahead and import the computed, so this will take a function, and the function in this case would just return something. So let's say counter larger than 5. All right. So if you now put them on, let's see, we'll decrease the HTML here, not so interesting. So what does this code really do for us? So look at it. The computed in this case is a computed signal which derives a reactive value from an expression. So in this case, it will rerun this computed value every time the counter changes. So for instance, if the counter is being changed to 5, to 4, to whatever it's being changed to, the is larger than 5 value will be recalculated, which is, as you can see, we do not need to have an ngIf, we do not need to have functions that would essentially recalculate this and so on. And just imagine how much less code we have to write in the Angular community. But keep in mind, a signal is synchronous, so it will not be a replacement for XJS observables, so you could probably use them together, and we're going to explore that in a later time of the video. So now that we have looked into the signal and the computed, the question is, now what else can we do? You can essentially have whatever thing you want to have. You could have an array, you could have an object instead of having the number. It's the same way you would use a default variable in this case, so except that it's a signal that we actually are using. So the question is, what else have been implemented that we can look into? So you could set the value. So in order for us to set the value, we'll do counter.set. So this would just set the value. There's also another way you could say counter.update, and here you could take the previous value and you could say previous value plus 1. So imagine that you have some async data, maybe you have some timeout somewhere and there, and you're actually setting the data which should be based on the previous value. So instead of doing this.counter plus 20, or in this case plus 1, you would utilize the update logic, because this one you will always be able to rely on the previous value being what it should be. In the previous case, the counter could be 20 in one case, and if you spam click a button, which is essentially doing some async data or things in the backend, what will happen is that the counter will be wrongfully set. So if you want to change it once, you do it in this way, but if you want to rely on that the value always will be whatever you expect it to be, it's quite similar to how you would set the state in React. So if you're used to actually setting the state, you would probably have a function callback in which would take the previous value, and you would have to set the new value that you want to update it. All right, so now that we got through these two, there's also even further things that you can use. So there's something called mutate. So you might think, what is the mutate in this case? Mutate, it's a method that modifies the content of the value. So for instance, we can modify parts of the value in an array, for instance. We could do a couple of different things for this, really. So for instance, the mutate, if you would have an object and you want to update a particular property within the object, you would use mutate, because updating would update the whole actual object that you want. Meanwhile, the mutate would only change the particular property in the actual object that you have. So for instance, if you would have a object here, so let's call it my object, and then we would have a object value. So let's not type this, I'm quite lazy right now. So we'll have name John, all right? And we'll have age 30. So if you want to change the age of John, in normal cases, you would have to update the whole object in order for you to actually receive this change. So if you want to change a particular property here without actually changing everything, you could essentially say mutate, and here we're going to have the previous, and then in the next we would have previous.name. In this case, sorry, it should not be counter, should be my object, by the way. So here we can say John is now going to be named Jane. So this is how you update a property within an object. You should use the mutate, otherwise you would have to provide the whole object itself. So this would be quite similar to actually doing, so in this case you would have my object, and then in this case you would have to, let's say, have the parentheses, and then you have to do it in this way. So this is quite similar to how you would essentially work with state management. You would have to spread in the state, and then you would mutate all of the other values that you want to be changed. And as you can see here, it would be much cleaner for you to only mutate a part of the actual signal that you have. So that's why you should use mutate when you want to update a part of the object. All right. So we're not really done here. There's also one last thing we want to look into. So if you have worked with useEffect in React world, you would have the you would be able to actually listen for changes with a dependency array, and you would be able to react on these changes. It could be that you want to console log something, or it could be that you want to do something else. So really in this case, you would say you have these the effect. So we can import the, let's put it in the constructor, obviously. We'll import it, and here we can say we're going to console log every time the counters change. We want to console log the value of the counter. So the way it works is that it will look for the dependencies, which in this case would be all of the signals that you have within it. So if you have multiple signals, it would re-evaluate and rerun whenever one of the signals changes. So it would be quite similar to how the use effect works in the React community. All right, so let's look into a beautiful pattern that we potentially could reuse in the future. So there's also a lot of discussions on how can we prepare before updating to the signals. So for instance, if you have a large enterprise application still in Angular 14 or 15, depends on how quick your organization is to update, and you haven't really tried out the release candidates because you might be a big organization and you usually rely on the LTS versions. So the question is, how can you prepare in order for your organization to be ready to switch up to the signals in a good time before? Also keep in mind that the signals are not going to change that we actually want to use behavior subjects. They could be a complement to each other. You could utilize them together in order to simplify your life. So we're going to explore a bit of different patterns that we can use within this video. So let's open up the terminal, and here we want to generate a service. So let's go ahead and generate a service. Let's call it data service, and let's hope, sorry, this was a component. So Angular generate service data. So we're generating a service called data service. So yeah, it seems like we already have a data service. So here we have a service which essentially just returns an empty array of data. So in this case, we'll just mimic how the backend would work. So we could give it a couple of just dummy data here. We could give it an ID, we could give it a name, some age, blah, blah, blah. And we could just make sure that we have a couple of objects here in this case. So we'll go with Jane, John, they could be the same age. So now we're simulating an API, really. Sorry, I saw that my image was in the way of it. So in this case, we're simulating an API called getAll. It will return an array of items, and then when we utilize it here, so we could inject it in the same way. But recently, I've started to like a different approach on actually doing it. So the way I would do it, essentially, I would inject the service with the inject. So we would say data service, and we'll do the inject. I will make a complete different video explaining why I prefer to have it in this way. And I think that will make more total sense for you once you have looked at that video. All right, so it will come within the couple of days after this, because I think that's something we all should share amongst the different teams to why you should stop using the inject if you don't, the dependency injection within the constructor unless you really need it. All right, so let's continue. We are injecting the service here. Now we can utilize it here. We can say, all right, so there's the data service. We can get all, and we can subscribe to the data and so on. Okay. So now let's imagine we still need to have a behavior subject. We will not get, the observables. We'll not be able to get rid of that yet anyway. So let's go ahead and say we'll take one so that it completes after we have fetched the data once, and we'll subscribe to it so that it actually executes the observable that we have. So now that we have done this, there's a couple of things we can do. Let's just remove all of the other code as for now. And we can say, all right, so in the service, when this is being triggered, it's being triggered with the subscription, right? So what we can do now is we can say pipe, and we can say we're going to tap to the value. So once the observable is being executed, we can tap into it and say, before we are actually completing it, we want to do a couple of things, all right? So we have the data. Here we could console log the data and so on if you wanted to do that, but let's not really do that. All right. Missing a parenthesis here and one at the end. All right. So now once this is done, let's create a signal. Imagine we have users. Imagine this would be a user service which essentially just fetches the users, and yeah. So we'll create a signal for users. So we'll have a user signal and we're going to give it the type any because, as I mentioned, I'm quite lazy within this video to create types. So really what you can do now is you can say, all right, so this dot users, and we can set it by saying set the data. All right, so we're going to give it a hard set. In this case, we do not need to update anything, we do not need to care about previous values and so on. So now that we have the users here, we can fetch the users from somewhere. Let's actually now start utilizing it in this way. So let's remove all of the boilerplate code that we had from before. Let's create a variable here. We'll call it users. It's going to be a signal. Let's see here. It's going to be signal. It's also going to be the type of any, unfortunately, and any array, and it's going to be in this way. So now we can say, all right, we want the users, and we're going to just point towards the signal that we have in the service. So this is a common way you would work with the behavior subjects, right? You could do it with the behavior subject in this way as well. So now we're just going to point towards this. So now the users that we have here is going to be the signal that we are having here in the service. So instead of actually handing the boilerplate code here in the actual component, we can just store it in the actual data service. All right, so let's save this and put the Chrome browser next to this. All right, so the last thing we want to do is go to the HTML file here and just change the counter to users instead, and then we're going to use the pipe here so that we actually can get an output. And to make it even better, we're going to add the pre-syntax so that we have some nice pretty. All right, so once this is done, there's a couple of things we want to do, right? We want to see that can we utilize these users within the header component. So we have the header component that you can see on the top. So we're going here, and in this case, we're just going to inject the service here. So we'll go with data service, and here we're going to say inject the data service, and we're going to import this stuff, and we're also going to give it the users in a similar way that we did before. Also keep in mind, we did not really need to put the users here. We could essentially just have it here, so we wouldn't have to really put it within the constructor. Less code is always better in this case if it's readable. All right, so let's continue. Does the users content, is it really available within here? So let's just put it in the bottom of the header file. All right, so we're just going to put it here. In a similar way, you need to have the function syntax in order for us to really get the data, and we can have it in this way. So as you can see now, we do not need to have any behavior subjects. We do not need to subscribe to anything. In this case, I would say, imagine how much code we can get rid of. We do not need to have any subscriptions within the header. We do not need to have anything really in this. And just imagine now what would happen if we would change it, right? So we could react to changes from the header component. We could react to changes from the app component. So this would be quite similar to how it would be with just a variable. In this case, the changes will just reflect from the service, from the service to the component in a similar way that if we would have just a regular variable. So in this case, how could we really, so we could say, all right, so let's go with the if effect here. So you just want to print something once the value is being changed. So let's go ahead and do this. And here we are going to say console log the users when the users is being changed. All right, so just by adding it here, it will automatically understand that, sorry, let's see here, this users, of course. It will automatically understand this. So let's open up the console log tab, and you'll see that we have two items here, right? So now what would happen if we change it from the actual app component now? So we're going back to the app component where it was generated. We're just going for now to set a set timeout. Obviously should not have it in this way. We're doing it just for us to see how the data would be mutated for in the HTML. And in this case, we're going to utilize, as you saw here, I'm using Google Copilot here. We're not going to add any user in this way. We're going to mutate the data directly from here. And just a heads up, guys, you usually want to stop mutating data in different components, because if you have 20, 15 components that listens to data from a particular service, it would be a pain in the ass to actually know from where it was mutated. So usually you would just create a function within the data service in this case that would change the value and so on, so that you have one source where the data is being mutated. This is a good pattern to look into. But for now we're going to place it here. So let's be a bit lazy, all right? So we want to set the data of the users, or really we just want to change the value of it. So we're going to use the mutate. So obviously I'm not really familiar with this syntax yet. So what we want to do now is we want to say this users.mutate. All right, so the user seems like we have no intelligence whatsoever, but we're going to use the mutate anyway. In this case, let's see what happens. Does not exist on. All right, so let's be a bit lazy. So the signal type here in this case seems like, yeah. After looking it up, seems like the typing is wrong here. That's my mistake. As I mentioned, I haven't worked really too much with the signals yet. It's something that I definitely will start looking into more and more with time given, obviously. So now imagine we're adding it here, so it should be the settable signal, and now we can utilize the mutate, and here will be the previous value, and we can say, all right, it's an array. Let's be a bit, so we can say previews at position 0 because it's an array. So if you would go into the get all function here, so 0 would come in here, and we can say that name is going to be changed to Jane. So we want to have Jane and Jane, all right? So let's remove the constructor here. So here we're going to say that name is going to be Jane. So now both of them should be named Jane, right? So reloading here, after 4 seconds, the data should be changed. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so now both of them should be named Jane. And imagine how little boilerplate code we need to write in order for us to actually mutate the data and change it from different places. I think this is a really nice pattern. I think that this is well deserved. And there's also a couple of things related to the how the actual components are being re-rendered and so on within the components. So in order for us to actually understand how this would be more performant than using the variables and so on in different cases, we'll have to look into what change detection is in Angular and how it's working today. So imagine we have the root component, so the most outer root of the Angular app. So we could say this is the root. Let's give it a bit larger size. So this is the root of the application, right? And then we'd have a couple of subcomponents. So you would have subcomponent 1, you could have subcomponent 2, component 3, and so on. And you could have like multiple subcomponents with components within. So it could be, just imagine the change detection tree that might occur. All right, so what does this really mean? I'm going to explain to you shortly what this might mean. And imagine we have hundreds of components and how this would just look like. It would be, I would say it would be quite insane. Let me just change the color because I realized this color is not really trivial. All right, so now that we have this in this way, we'd probably want to have some pencil so that we can draw it instead of having to do the lines. So you would have, let's see if we can make the lines a bit larger. All right, so now that we have it in this way, we can just draw the lines. You would have a tree probably looking like this. You would have a component within a component within a component, and this is not a very uncommon case. So every time something changes with change detection in Angular, what would happen is that it would re-render the whole tree. So imagine you have hundreds of components and so on, and it's really re-rendering all of these components. It would be a mess for you. So if you have all of these components that would be re-rendered, it would be quite time consuming. So even though it happens really quick in most cases, I would say, there's still an issue with this, right? So the issue is that it re-renders everything. So with signals, or if you have worked with Angular for a long time, you know there's a couple of ways to actually opt out of the natural change detection cycle by using on-push strategy and so on. But really, that was also quite cumbersome because you would have to opt in and opt out in different scenarios when you really want the DOM to be reflecting and so on. Now imagine we're using signals. You have signals down here in the chain of the tree or in the root of the tree. It really this doesn't matter. So wherever this signal is being used is is where it's only will be changed. So we're kind of not using the zone.js in this case to change with the change detection. So if we would have a change here, it would only reflect this change here. It would not re-render anything. Just imagine how much more performant that would be rather than updating all of the DOM tree. So I think you get the point on the performance that comes with the signal in this case. So even if it would look like similar to work with variables as it would be to actually use these signals, the case would be that the signals will be much more performant. So if you have a website which essentially utilizing a lot of DOM elements and so on, this is definitely going to be something that you want, and definitely something you want to start looking into as soon as possible. So also keep in mind that this is something that will come in the future for Angular 16 potentially. We'll hope for it anyway. I think the whole community is just waiting for this to be released. But there's also a lot of concerns, right? So I'm receiving a lot of questions on how should we prepare for this. We already have enterprise application not utilizing these signals and so on. How can we put up strategic plans of migrating it to signals in the future? So there's a couple of things you can do. You could create help clauses that would essentially be easier for you to change with in the future. So you could change, for instance, variables to work with the signals and so on. But imagine you have a super large enterprise project. I would say, I'm quite sorry, but there's many cases where you will have to do the manual change yourself. So let's get back to the VS Code. In this case, we have the code here, and yeah, this just mutates the value and so on, but just imagine a way we could make this more beautiful. You could create a clause. If you haven't seen my video about perform clause, that actually fetches data from the backend and then sends the data and so on. There's ways you could do it here similar with the signals. So we just create a clause. Let's call it perform clause.ps. We're going to keep this quite basic. So export clause perform. It's going to take in the generic type T. It's also going to have a couple of different things. So it's loading equals to false. We also want to have as errors equals to false. We also want to have the data in this case. So it's going to be of data T or undefined, with the default value is going to be undefined. And then we want to have, for instance, a load function here, which essentially taking an observable. So usually we want to fetch something from the backend and we want to save it in a variable, right? That's quite common when you have loaders. So what you want to do here in this case, we maybe want to have a storage of this observable because we want to reload it or something in the future. So we go with the observable with type T because it's going to return whatever data we want to have, and this also is going to be undefined as a default, or it will be potentially undefined. So in this case, we're going to take an observable which is going to be of type T. Whenever we take it, we want to assign the local one that we have. So this observable is because we want to store it, and whenever we reload the data or we fetch the data, we want to first set the data to be undefined because we do not have anything within the data. We're not going to have an empty array or anything. We're just going to go with undefined. Also keep in mind we're using isLoading and has errors, so if you're familiar to working with the Redux state management pattern, you would really see how these variables could simplify your life. So we're going to look into this clause really and see how this could work. All right. So continuing with this, we have the observable that's being triggered. So we're triggering it here. Let's go ahead and say pipe. We're going to go with pipe take 1 because we want it to complete after we have fetched the data. Also, let's remove we could have the next and error. It's quite nice as well. So whenever the data is being loaded, we're just storing it locally and we're setting the isLoading to false. And if we receive an error, we have the error, but the isLoading is going to be false. All right, so what can we do now when we have the signal? So imagine now we have a signal, we want to store the value. So instead of having the data, in this case, we could have the data signal or whatever you want to call it. Let's go ahead with the data signal in this case. And this is going to be settable signal, and it's going to be of the type T. And let's see here, it's also going to be potentially undefined. Because if you haven't called the data, you need to set it to be undefined, because when you inject the perform clause within the component where it's being used, you're not really going to have anything for it. So what can we do? Once the data has been fetched, we can say this dot data signal, and we're going to set the value. All right. So now we're setting the data. Now we can react to the signals that we have from different parts of the component that we use. But also keep in mind, this is going to be not going to be a singleton pattern, so it's not going to be available in all different services and so on. This is just one way of not having to write too many services that holds too much logic, so you could have clauses that would simplify your life a lot. Alright, so going back to the app component file now, just imagine we have the service that we have here. You would just inject the perform clause. Let's just call it perform in this case, and we're going to create a new stance of it. Also, we're going to just give it the type any. I'm a bit ashamed when I add it, but let's do it just for visual purposes. And now we can say that this.perform. In this case, we're going to load. We're going to use the load function. We're just going to pass in the subscription. We do not need to have the data service here and so on. We're just going to pass in the subscription. And in this case, on the perform clause, we'll have a couple of things available for us. So we'll have this.perform, the data signal, the data, we'll have the hash error, it's loading, we'll have the load, we have the observable and so on. Maybe you want to make the observable private because you probably do not want to be able to change it from outside here. And the same thing might be for a couple of other things as well. But that's another question on how we can set it up. So most likely you do not want to be able to change if it's loading and so on from outer. This is something you probably want to have private, and you want to use the getter sensitives. But now we have the load here. So what can we do, and how is this really going to help us? So if you now go to the HTML, we're probably going to have a couple of issues here. So we have the perform.data signal, right? So now if I would go back to the HTML that we have, let's see here, and now let's just make the screen a bit like this. Now we have the console log and we have the data here, right? So this is the data that's being prompted from here. So we can just write here to make sure that's actually from here as well. So it was not from here really, so we need to look into why it's not really being updated in this way. Alright, I see the problem instantly. Obviously that was so stupid, so we need to create the signal obviously instead of having the variable in this way. So now that we have the signal, we can have the undefined variable being set here. And it's not going to be settable like this, it's just going to be t or undefined, and the default value is going to be undefined. So sorry for that confusion. Now that we have this cleared up, we can go back to the to the app component now and reload the page, and we should be able to see a couple of different changes. So we can see the data is not being presented. Let's go to the HTML. Obviously, I usually forget this because I'm quite new to the signals as well. So always when you want to fetch data, you need to pass in the parentheses in order for it to actually fetch the data. All right, so now we have created a clause, which is, if you're just looking at the amount of boilerplate code that we write, it's super little. So just imagine what you can do with it in the future. So this service is essentially doing a couple of different things. We can the class is doing a couple of different things. So now we can just print out what we have. We have is loading, has error, we have the observable and so on. This obviously needs to be private and so on, but just look at the boilerplate code we had to write in order for us to have the loading state, our error states, and all of different kind of things. So the question is now, how can I mutate parts of the data? The real answer would be that you would have to build in some logic here to handle either upsert logic, where you essentially upsert an object within the array. So if you'd have some crawl logic, you would have to add an item or remove an item, or essentially just update an item, right? So this is something you could add to the perform clause. And now the question might be, why do I want to have a clause? You could essentially have a service. If you want to have singleton behaviors for this, you could have a service which utilizes this clause in order for you to really clean up the code, keep it in one place. This will be super easy to test and so on. Alright guys, this is the basics of signals. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching. All of the best. Bye.